Should I say 4? What is it about? There's magic numbers up next. Swift. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me from the back there? This is working? Yeah, thanks. So welcome again to another one of these Express seminars. Just before we go any further, there are no fire alarms or anything going on planned for tonight, so if it goes off, it's the real McCoy. The exits are down here or out the back the way you came in, and the muster point is over towards the Great Court next to the arches there. I'm going to welcome here Dr. Elliot Tonkes. We've got some latecomers here. It's all right, Peter. You just sit there. Dr. Elliot Tonkes, who's an experienced risk professional and market analyst. He's an outstanding commercial and academic background. He's a deep understanding of the energy sector, which is why you're all here, including electricity, gas, environmental and carbon markets. He's experienced in working within and alongside commercial generators and retailers, integrated energy companies, regulators and the government. For various clients and partners, Elliot's conducted quantitative market analysis, decision support, forecasting, risk quantification, and derivative pricing. He's performed roles in due diligence, in assisting with policy formulation, and his qualifications in engineering with a BE Mech. Is that from UQ, by the way? Good choice, yeah. Thank you for your custom. And also a BSc and a PhD in mathematics, and he's conducted research in various pure and applied topics. So with that, I'll ask you to welcome Dr. Elliot Tonkes. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you, and thanks for coming along tonight. So my name is Elliot, and I've worked for the last 15, 20 years or so in the energy sector, and I've seen it evolving through that time, and there's a lot of interesting aspects to it, and it continues to evolve and become more and more complex. And this talk is one that I've given over a few years to incoming master's students at UQ, and every year this talk evolves because there's something new and topical that's happening in the sector. And so we'll get on to what's new and bright and shiny as we get through this talk. This talk is actually just a long rambling introduction through the energy markets in Australia, and often it's guided by the questions that you might have as we go along. So I welcome you to throw your hand up and ask questions as we progress, and it might raise some insights and lead the discussion down various paths. The introduction sort of talked a bit about my background, but in particular I come from a business called Energy Edge. I'm a part-time consultant there. And I guess it's a boutique consulting firm that focuses in electricity, gas, environmental sector in Australia. So we answer questions like a big energy company says we would like to sell our power station, or we'd like to buy someone else's power station. How much should we pay for it? Or a company that says we'd like to put a trading strategy in place to sell forward our power because we think that the price of power might be declining over the next couple of years, and we'd like to lock in our profits now. How do we go about that, and what's the best trading strategy to put in place? Or other questions like a company with a gas-fired power station. Should we be buying gas for it now, or the gas that we have, should we sell it off and export it through a different channel? So those sort of strategic and quantitative problems are the ones that we work on in our business. And hopefully as we progress through this slide, you'll see how that gas and electricity and the renewables and the carbon and the policy all fit together in an integrated framework. I do say an integrated framework like it's some planned, coordinated thing, but really it's a bit of chaos. And those that can find the order in the chaos are the ones that can exploit the opportunities and turn it into profit. So this is the slide that we're going to work through, and we're just going to add more and more features to it to show how that complexity has grown across the last, well, in reality, it's about 20 years. So the NEM has been around about 20 years, the National Electricity Market. And that's kind of the point of focus that we'll use in the discussion. And then there'll be other markets, gas markets and coal markets, that surround that central national electricity market. So the NEM was one of Paul Keating, the Hawke-Keating reforms. It was really promoted by Paul Keating, and the NEM started in 1998. It covers Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia at its initiation in 98. And Tasmania has been added in the meantime. It doesn't go across to Western Australia. It's just not economical to interconnect, to put copper and aluminium across to Western Australia. And it doesn't go across to Northern Territory either. In fact, there's remote regions inside of Queensland that are not covered by the NEM as well. Mount Isa is a large-sized grid, but there's no power line that goes to Townsville. It's an isolated grid. So what's in the NEM? We have customers on one side, consumers. They're using electricity, so there's a source of demand on one side. It's you and I switching on lights, devices and appliances, big industry, small industry, commercial, and so on. And that is serviced by power stations on the other side. And realistically, at the moment, those power stations are coal-fired power stations. So coal-fired power stations really at the moment constitute roughly 70% of the generation, 60 to 70% of the generation that's producing the electricity in the NEM. There's a bit of a distance here between the consumption source, consumption location and the generation location, and that's because the coal fields aren't on the doorstep of Brisbane. So we've got some great coal resources in Australia. There's some sort of around Millmerran Way. There's around the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, and there's Latrobe Valley in Victoria. So those power stations, for economic reasons, are essentially sited on those coal resources. And then it becomes cheaper to transmit the electricity through the high-tension cables than it does to transport the coal. But there's not just one power station. Those power stations are distributed across the NEM, and they're all slightly different technologies. So in the Latrobe Valley, we've got brown coal, which is realistically filthy sludge that's just dredged up out of the ground and then has to be dried first before you can even burn it. So there's internal consumption of power to create the power and then pushed through. Queensland and New South Wales typically have black coal, but once again, those power stations are quite often built right on the mouth of the mine, essentially so close that the bulldozers will push the coal straight into the hoppers, which go straight into the power station. And there's power stations of more efficiency and less efficiency in the NEM in that coal sphere, but realistically, they all sit around about the 35% level of thermal efficiency. When you start talking about the super high efficient coal power stations, it's not even getting up towards the 50% mark. It's maybe in the low 40s. And the consumption sources are also spread across the NEM. Now that NEM, so there's also many coal mines servicing those power stations. That NEM is the longest, skinniest, single connected market in the world. So it goes right from Cooktown all the way down to Hobart and across to Adelaide. So it's an extremely long, skinny network. When I say a skinny network, what I mean is that we couldn't have all of the power generation in around Chinchilla, where there's a whole heap of coal, and use that to service demand in Adelaide. We just couldn't get the power down those power lines, and it'd be inefficient anyway because there'd be so many thermal losses. The thinness of that transmission line does introduce all sorts of interesting characteristics when it comes to price outcomes in the NEM. So now I'm going to drill into how this works in a commercial setting. So whether you're in communist China or in capitalist America, the infrastructure that you see there has got to be in place to deliver electricity to customers. A point of generation, a point of transmission, and a consumption. But then how the dollars flow back and forth really delineates the different market structures that there are for electricity. The structure that we have in Australia, in the NEM, is termed a gross pool. And what that means is if you're a power station, then you are compelled to sell all of your power, not to customers, but into this central desk in the middle here, into the NEM, into a body called AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator. Who's that? Well, it's a not-for-profit organisation owned by the government, owned by you and me, that really administers the market. It has two jobs, really. The first job is the physical side of making sure the electricity supply is reliable and issuing instructions to power stations and performing metering and other administrative duties. And the second role is essentially as a stock exchange, as the clearinghouse for the market. So in its role as the clearinghouse, power stations must sell their power to AEMO. And as consumers, we don't buy it from power stations, we buy it from AEMO. In fact, we of course buy it from retailers, but the retailers on our behalf are buying it from the market operator AEMO. How do the power stations sell it into the grid? Well, they offer it in a poor terminology, legacy terminology, they provide bids to the market, which are really offers to sell electricity. So a power station will say, if the price is sufficiently high, then I'm willing to sell power. And if the price is even higher, then I'm willing to sell even more power. And if you make the price really high, then I'm going to sell even more power into the market. If the price is really, really high, actually, I've already told you everything. I don't have any more to sell. So power stations can essentially max out. There's a maximum capacity that each power station has to generate into the market. So this is an economic supply curve. Each power station has an economic supply curve that offers a certain quantity at a certain price. Technically, they offer it in 10 bands, but it looks something like this. So as the price goes higher and higher, the power station is willing to offer more and more generation into the grid. Each power station has one of these. They're all aggregated together by the market operator into a global supply curve. Price and quantity. And then what happens is you and I turn on our switches and devices. We are completely impervious. We have no idea what the price of wholesale power is. We want to use electricity, so we turn on our devices. Economically, it's an inelastic demand, but an elastic supply. So you and I switch on our devices, all of us together. We end up with some particular demand for the system. I can read up here and read across. And that becomes the price in the wholesale market. And that price is won by every single power station. So even if I'm a power station saying, I'm willing to sell my electricity at next to nothing, the price that I will actually receive is the centrally cleared price that is the balance between supply and demand. Now, this process of setting the price for power is done every 5 minutes. There's a new price for electricity set in the NEM every single 5 minutes. You might be able to detect from this diagram that if we happen to have a bit of a sudden heat spell, came out of nowhere, and this demand increased up to here, then there's the new price, and it could increase quite substantially, particularly if we're at a point where this curve is kind of getting quite vertical. And you may hear about there being heat waves and prices going crazy in the NEM. They can call them price spikes. And that's when this curve has almost hit a vertical point, and small changes in demand levels can lead to enormous changes in price. So what does that price look like? Peter, I'd like to push click one of these buttons on the slideshow. Not sure if the mouse is connected. Oh, is it? Oh, okay, great. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. I'm right now. Thank you, Peter. So this is what the spot price for electricity looks like. In fact, this is presented in half-hourly resolution. The market is dispatched every 5 minutes, but when it comes time to settle, to pay each other, 6 lots of the 5 minutes are aggregated into half hours. So it's a half-hourly cleared market. You can see here, this is a period from January 2019. Several days, and I can see the middle of the day when things are getting warm. Things are getting warm, the demand goes higher. Demand goes higher, price goes higher. So here are the daily patterns that you can detect. That's the middle of the night, or more like 3 a.m. Middle of the day, back to 3 a.m., middle of the day, 3 a.m., middle of the day. This is probably a weekend, possibly a weekend day, and a weekday. So that's typically what the electricity structure looks like, electricity price structure. Roughly around $50 to $100 per megawatt hour. That's the wholesale price. Your electricity bill at home is going to be around about $250 per megawatt hour, but it contains a whole lot of other things as well. Here's another day. You can see that this price, it's not an error. This price kind of went crazy at this point in time. In fact, it looks like it went down to zero. It can go worse than that. It can go negative. The electricity price can go to negative $1,000 per megawatt hour under the market rules. Now, who would design such a crazy market as that? Oh, we did. And why would you allow prices to go negative? Well, it's because I own a power station that I really don't want to switch off. If I switch a power station off, a coal-fired power station, it costs a lot of money to restart. We're talking $100,000 just to restart the power station. It started on oil. So I really don't want to switch off. In fact, even if the price goes to zero, I really don't want to switch off. Even if the price goes negative, it's better for me to take a hit of negative money than to switch my power station off. And when power stations compete against each other to say, no, I really can't, no, I really can't, no, I really, really can't, no, I really, really can't, what happens is the bids can go sufficiently low, and in this situation, what happened is there was a negative price. There's more nuances to it as well, and often it's due to the intricacies of power line constraints. That won't drill into here, but the fact that I can't get certain power across power lines to the level I want can lead to these price anomalies. And here's a big day. Notice the scale that you see here. Price normally $50 to $100 per megawatt hour. You can see the price here going to $12,000, $14,000 per megawatt hour. So hundreds of % increase in price for a short period of time. If you're a retailer buying electricity, and you typically buy at 50, buy at 100, buy at 50, buy at 100, so if things are financially going good, 50, 100, 10,000, I'm selling to customers at a price of 200, but now have to buy my goods at a price of 14,000. So it's a terrifying market to operate in as a chief financial officer. In terms of turning this into a volatility number, here are some familiar sort of commodities. The ASX 200 index, BHP shares, a volatile share, the Australian US exchange rate, around about 10% volatility. So these say that over a year, you could expect the price to move plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 20%, that sort of order of deviation across a year. When you put spot price electricity in there, this is where NEM electricity lives in terms of annualized volatility compared to those other commodities. In fact, it doesn't even make sense anymore to talk about volatility because it's a concept that doesn't even match with regular commodity markets. So they're the price outcomes that happen in the NEM. And remember, as a power station or as a retailer, you are compelled to operate in the NEM by buying through that central desk. You can't ask for a private supply agreement, so you are necessarily exposed to this volatility, which sounds like a bad thing, right? That you're forcing me to be exposed to this massive price volatility. But the economic theory is that where there's big price volatility, it issues a signal to operators. It says, spot price has gone extremely high. This is an incentive for you, power station, to come in and operate because you can make a lot of money. The price has gone high. That price signal, because the price is high, is because the demand is high. And you coming in to take advantage of that high price means you're supplying the customers who wanted the electricity in the first place. And so the invisible hand does its job of using price as a signal to guide market behaviour. So P is that pool price for electricity. And these machines here, these power stations, are really machines which convert a fuel to electricity and take a profit from the spread between the price of coal and the price of electricity. Roughly speaking, a coal-fired power station, about a half of its cost is the variable cost of coal, and about the other half of its cost is the capital cost of building a power station in the first place. Pretty close to you and I driving a car. Half of our driving expenses are from buying the car, the capital cost of the car in the first place, and the other half is from the price of petrol. Now, the fact that these retailers and these generators are exposed to such highly volatile spot prices introduces a commercial problem, because no business really wants to operate in an environment where the price of the product is $50 one day and then $2,000 the next day. It's a high-stress environment to work in. So the way that this is resolved is the evolution of a completely separate secondary market termed the derivative market or contract market. This world down here is termed the physical market. It's the physical supply of electricity and the and being paid for that supply of electricity, physically supplying or consuming. This one here is a derivative market where the quantities being sold, the commodities being sold are just pieces of paper. They're derivative products. This is the world of AEMO and the Australian Energy Regulator. And this is a world which is completely different. This is the world of ASIC and corporations law. So in jurisdiction terms, these are completely separated. And it's mainly engineers here, isn't it? Mainly a mixture. Okay, all right, well, I'll take a position. The people operating in this market are salt of the earth, good people. The people in this market drive Porsches and have fancy haircuts. But it's this sector here which provides the risk management for this sector. So it may seem counterintuitive or maybe a strange way to go, to create this market which necessarily induces a whole lot of risk and needs this separate market to mitigate that risk on the other side. So how these things work, typically these are products called swaps or futures contracts. And this generator may suffer if that spot price is extremely low. And this retailer may suffer if that spot price is extremely high. They're paying way too much for their electricity. So these two businesses get together on the outside and say, all right, as a generator, I'm going to suffer if the spot price is too low. So if the spot price goes really low, I'll pay you some cash. Then if the spot price goes really low, you'll supply me a bit of cash. And if the spot price goes really high, I'm going to supply you a bit of cash. The retailer, on the other hand, says, if the spot price is really high, then I'm suffering. You'll supply me some cash. And if the spot price is really low, and I've got a windfall, I'll supply you the cash. And by undertaking such a deal, they can mitigate the risk of this spot price. There's various derivative instruments in this market, and it's quite a liquid market. Multiply around about 3 to 5 means for every megawatt hour of electricity actually consumed, this market buys it, sells it, buys it, sells it, and buys it again. So it's not just generators and retailers operating in this market. Westpac Bank is an enormous player. Macquarie Bank and other speculative businesses and trading houses also operate in this market. But they can't operate in this physical market because they don't own power stations or customer loads. The ASX, the Australian Securities Exchange, lodges a whole lot of futures contracts on this market. And if you really wanted to, you could go in and buy those futures contracts yourselves. That cost, so I have a small business cost. So the question is, all of this infrastructure here, if I split it over the cost to consumers, how much does it add to my electricity bill at home? For an individual organisation, the cost of having a trading desk is quite small in comparison to the cost of power stations and so on. It does, however, provide these businesses with the opportunity of raising capital at lower prices because it stabilises their bottom line and P&L. So I don't have a dollar figure for you, but it's not a large explicit number that comes out as a huge cost that's incorporated in your electricity bill. In the long term, on average, buying your electricity through the spot market should be the same as hedging it through this derivative market. Because if it's not, then there's a systematic way of you being able to make money. If this market here systematically and consistently prices differently to these outcomes, then something like a Westpac Bank would recognise that. They'd dive in and they'd start making super profits. And the fact of them being in there in the first place dissipates those profits. And the fact that people know about it also means they come in and the profits disappear. So in the long run, this contract price here over about a 15-year period has been about 50 cents per megawatt hour out of 40-something dollars, different to this average spot price outcome. So it's quite close. But there is a small administrative cost of running these markets. Now, these coal commodities, coal that's used for the power station, several different models. Sometimes these power stations are built on fairly crappy coal resources. And those coal resources are not of export quality in the first place. They're nicely well placed in terms of infrastructure, in terms of access to transmission lines, but you wouldn't build a coal mine for export purposes. Some power stations rail in or truck in their coal. And if you're a coal mine that does have access to an export channel, close to a port perhaps, and you have access to a rail line, then you have a choice whether you send your coal out for export to the rest of the world or if you sell your coal to the power station. Now, as a hard-nosed coal mine operator, if there's no long-term agreement with the power station, then you choose the higher of these prices. And so you could mount an argument that says this world price of coal should flow through to the decision that this mine manager is making, and therefore affect the price of fuel for this power station, and therefore affect the price for power, because this power station is making its offers into the market on the basis of its cost. However, there's too many of these coal mines that do not have access to export, or the coal isn't of adequate quality to export, or they're tied up in long-term contracts here. So this world price for coal does not significantly flow through to our domestic price for electricity. From time to time it does, particularly through the Newcastle hub when additional mines or export channels are opened. The next big player in the market is the gas. So AEMO, who runs the NEM, used to be called NEMCO. It used to be the National Electricity Market Management Company. But in 2009, it absorbed the gas markets in Australia as well. And the gas markets are now under the jurisdiction of AEMO. When I say gas markets, the electricity market looks golden and perfect in comparison to the mess that is the gas markets. Electricity is all sold through essentially one market channel. But in the gas markets, my goodness. So I'd say there's 5 different components to the gas markets in Australia. First is there's old school, which is bilateral agreements. And that's gas producers getting in touch with gas consumers. So conventional gas producer getting in touch with a fertilizer works, doing a deal on the price for gas and selling gas directly under a bilateral agreement. That's how most of the gas deals were done in the past, but there's no transparency. The price is opaque, the supply and demand levels are all opaque. If you're a new player coming in, you've got no idea about what price your competitors are paying or if it's a fair price or not. So the reforms in recent years have been to open up, to put some sunlight on the gas market so these prices are visible to everyone. So now there's 3 different formal gas markets in Australia. Victoria has a market called the Declared Wholesale Gas Market. And it looks a little bit like the way the electricity market operates. It's an interval market. The electricity market operates in half-hourly intervals, but the gas market in Victoria operates in 4-hourly blocks, except for one of the blocks, which is 8 hours long, which makes everything computationally difficult to work with. But that's confined to Victoria. The next sort of gas market is called the STTM, the short-term trading market. And there's 3 pieces of this. It's the pipeline coming into Sydney, the pipeline coming into Adelaide, and the pipeline coming into Brisbane, the Roma to Brisbane pipeline. And the STTM is just confined to trade to gas deliveries on that pipeline because it's coming into a large consumption hub, being the capital city of each state. So there's another piece which was produced and didn't go any further. That's the short-term trading market. And then there's a gas supply hub, the Wallumbilla gas supply hub, which has expanded a little bit. And that market model looks like the Henry Hub in Texas in terms of the market structure. So it's a physical market for the purchase and sale of gas. But under each of these market structures, they all look quite different. It's a bit like, what might be an example? A company that's trying to raise money can do it through issuing equity or maybe borrowing money through debt. So there's bond markets over there for raising debt, and then there's share markets over here for raising equity. And they all look quite different and have quite different rules. It's a little bit like that with gas. There's all these different market structures. On top of that, all of those markets are simply for the purchase and sale of gas itself, the purchase and sale of the energy. I actually have to get the gas from the field to the consumption source. And that's another market again. So there is a market for transport of gas. There's a bilateral arrangement, and now there's trading on that market as well. So the gas market has got all sorts of pieces to it, and it's complex to work in. When it comes to the electricity, interaction with electricity, we have gas-fired power stations in the NEM. Roughly 10% of the NEM is on gas, of the electricity is produced through gas. And there are 2 main sorts of power stations on gas. Open cycle, which is a bit like a plane engine converted into generating electricity. Roughly about the same efficiency as coal-fired power stations, about 35%. And then there's combined cycle power stations, which are much more efficient and have an efficiency something around about 50% or even better. Owners of those power stations make money by purchasing gas, converting it to electricity, and selling the electricity. So they extract what's called a spread, a spark spread, between the price of electricity and the price of gas. What is that price of gas? Well, that depends on which market you operate in. But what is it influenced by? Well, does that gas have an alternative channel? If I'm a producer of this gas, what can I do with it? I could sell it to the power station, or I could sell it to industry, or if there's a channel available to me, I can pipe it to Gladstone and sell it as LNG. So if the LNG facilities are crying out for every bit of gas that they can get their hands on, and that gas is being sold at a world price linked to oil price, then as a producer, if this price looks good, or if I'm even obliged to sell through this channel, then this price will find its way through to the price of gas in the domestic market, and that will find its way through to the price of electricity in the domestic market. Now, this linkage has been much greater than the linkage between coal and electricity. And the reason that this linkage is so great is because gas generators are the ones that live in this space here. Remember how I said that as a coal-fired power station, you get the same price as everyone else? Everyone gets paid the same. So even if I bid all my electricity in at a very low price, the price that I'm actually going to receive is the clearing price, which is set by the market. That clearing price has some power stations that are close to the margin. And those power stations that are close to the margin are the gas-fired power stations. So if they change their bids a bit, they will drive the price of electricity. If the coal power stations down here change their price a bit, they have no effect on that clearing price. So how much has that price of gas varied in recent times? Well, a lot of this comes back to the engineering behind coal seam in Queensland. We're now in a situation of exporting a lot of coal seam gas. And that coal seam gas is produced from many, many wells. The wells are from my understanding, from holes drilled in the ground, many, many holes, many, many wells. The gas is coming up, essentially can't be stopped. The gas can't be stopped. Once it's flowing, it's limited in the amount that those wells can be capped. So 2015, 2016, LNG exports started. Working back from that, we needed to have hundreds and hundreds of wells produced for 2016. But those wells could not be produced overnight. There was a long-term well drilling program in place across the previous decade. Those wells were drilled. They started producing gas, but there was essentially no home for that gas to go to because LNG trains were not yet built at Gladstone. So there was a large supply of excess gas in Queensland from the period probably 2005 to 2015 as these wells were sunk and produced gas which couldn't be stopped. And as a gas producer, what can I do with this gas? I can't stop it coming up. I could flare it, I could just burn the gas, or there's some power stations. I can sell it to the power stations, and whatever I get for it, it's better than flaring it. In fact, during the carbon regime, flaring the 2012 to 2014 carbon tax period, flaring the gas cost me money because I produced carbon. So during that period, there was a large excess of gas, and it was sold at a price of roughly 50 cents per gigajoule, essentially given away for free. And there was a large amount of gas generation during that period. However, when the LNG trains started to export, that gas was diverted to export. That world price for gas has flowed through into a domestic price for gas above $10 per gigajoule. So 50 cents per gigajoule has gone to $10 per gigajoule. And those gas-fired power stations have reduced dramatically the amount of electricity they're producing. In fact, if you're a gas-fired power station that had the contracts for gas, it was often more economical to sell that gas back to its suppliers than to run the power station in the first place. The next part of the puzzle is renewable generators. So as far back as 2001, in 2001, the Howard government passed the renewable energy target. And what they were trying to get is 2% of electricity produced from renewable sources. Not 2% in total, actually, 2% more, because there was already substantial renewable generation in place through Snowy scheme and through Tasmania before that point in time. So the way that this works, the objective was to foster the growth of the renewable sector and to start thinking about carbon emissions reductions. That was the 2001 policy by the Liberal government under John Howard. Now, the way that this worked is that if you put a wind farm on the ground, you would produce power and you would be paid for that power at whatever this market price is. But in the past, that capital cost of putting the power station on the ground, the wind farm on the ground, it cost more than the typical price of power. It was not an economical proposition. So, what was introduced are renewable energy certificates. If you produce 1 megawatt hour of wind generation, then you were paid for that 1 megawatt hour, but you also received one certificate, one renewable energy certificate. How does that renewable energy certificate have value? Well, the legislation said that as a consumer, you had to buy a proportion of your power, of certificates proportional to your power. And that gave these certificates value, and that produces an extra revenue source for these wind farms, and that's what made them become viable. Now, that renewable energy target has gone through evolution through time, and it's presently seeking to get to about 20% of the electricity production levels by next year, 2020. And that 20% level will flatline until 2030, and then we face a cliff edge at 2030 at the moment. Now, that was all working fine and good, but in 2011, this became administratively quite difficult, because what was happening is there were really two main sorts of renewable, well, I guess there's three big sorts of renewable generation being put on the ground in Australia. There's hydro, large-scale hydro, there's large-scale wind farms, and then there's solar. And solar is either rooftop solar or it's utility-scale solar. Around 2011, what was happening is we saw the boom in rooftop solar happening. And what happened at this point is they said, administratively, this scheme is getting too difficult. Let's carve it out into two schemes. A small scheme for rooftop solar and a large scheme for everyone else. Still in aggregate targeting the 20% of renewable generation, but the scheme was divided. Oop. I've skipped ahead there. So renewable energy certificates were split into large-scale, large wind farms and small-scale STCs, small technology certificates. Now, this slide is a couple of years old, but it shows what's going on in the demand space, in the solar, rooftop solar space. This is a timeline, January 2003 up to 2014. And these are the maximum monthly demands in Queensland. So the total Queensland demand, about 9,000 megawatts in 2010. And from 2010 onwards, 2012, 11, 12, 13, you can see that the maximum demand levels were dropping in Queensland. This took regulators and the market operators by complete surprise. Incidentally, this is the period in here of the carbon tax being in place, which shows it may have had some effectiveness. Since this point in time, the demand has risen again quite dramatically, and it's up near 10,000 megawatts in Queensland. But in 2010, at this period here of high demand, this is what a February day looked like. In fact, there's 28 February days there. So you can see there's midnight, 3 a.m. when everyone's in bed, 6 a.m. we're turning on our toasters, it's getting hot, we're turning on our air conditioning, the air conditioning is really cranking. We all come home, we go to bed, and power consumption falls away. That's 2010. But this is 2014. Again, we've got midnight, going to bed, everyone's in bed, air conditioners coming on, but we don't have this round top anymore. And that round top has been chopped off because of rooftop solar. That's what's coming in there to diminish demand. Because in electricity sectors, when we talk about demand, it has several different frames of reference. But in the wholesale market, demand means what's being asked from the big centralized power stations. So if you produce rooftop solar, it contributes to reducing demand rather than being an extra source of supply. Now, in 2012 to 2014, there was explicit pricing being imposed on carbon. This was again essentially through a system of certificates, but there are two ways that certificates can operate. One is that certificates can be an additional cost on the consumption side, and that's what happens with the renewable target. The other market model is for the cost to be imposed on the production side. And that's what was done with the carbon tax in 2012 to 2014. And under most emissions trading schemes, that's the way it works. So if you're a coal-fired power station and produced 1 megawatt hour of electricity, you paid for the equivalent fuel cost for that, but you also had to buy one carbon emissions certificate at around about $20 per megawatt hour. And that contributed to an increase in your cost of production, and that would flow through into your bid, and then that would flow through into the electricity spot price. If you're a gas-fired power station, then your carbon intensity is only about a half of a coal-fired power station. So your additional carbon cost is only about a half of the additional cost of the coal-fired power station. There it's an additional $20 per megawatt hour. There it's an additional $10 per megawatt hour. And therefore you have a lesser cost passes through into your bid, and therefore you're more competitive in the spot market. In 2014, that carbon tax was repealed, and then we saw these become less competitive, and coal-fired generation increased essentially at midnight on the 1st of July 2014. The other one that I was talking through before was when the renewable scheme split to a large scheme and a small-scale scheme. The situation we're in now is that there's two main points of regulatory interest in the electricity sector, and that's the reliability and emissions levels. Reliability is all about the fact that we've gone through a whole lot of regulatory uncertainty in the market. Will carbon be in? Will carbon be out? What's happening with these targets on the renewable subsidies that are provided to these potential new investments? And what it's meant is that there's been price signals. This is a great opportunity to come and make a lot of money because the electricity price has been high, the renewables price has been high, but people have not been investing. It's high now, but it's potentially going to fall away quickly, and I don't have long-term certainty for that investment. So there's some desire from the politicians to have reliability in positions in the market. And they will support these renewable generators in the grid. They can be supplied through battery technologies or possibly through thermal power stations. The other one is the emissions intensity. Now, it's unfortunately both political parties are backed into a corner, and they cannot have a carbon tax and they cannot have carbon trading, emissions trading. Politically, it's painted into a corner. So the request from the government has been to establish how we can have a market structure to limit carbon emissions, but without having certificates and without having a tax, but doing the same job as those, but not calling it a tax or having certificates. The mechanism that's come up there is the National Energy Guarantee, which is in a status of hiatus at the moment. And the way that that is intended to work is to say that these retailers, these consumers, must now identify, following back, who their power is coming from. And the whole idea of a gross market is that an electron is an electron, and I can't tell where my electrons come from. I'm selling all these fungible electrons into the grid, and I'm consuming all these fungible electrons out of the grid. And I don't need to know where they actually came from. But under this new emissions trading, not emissions trading, emissions management scheme under the NEG, the idea is that retailers will be responsible for ensuring that their source electricity is not too carbon intensive by identifying the power stations that it came from. In terms of, it doesn't really fit with this market structure, which has made it quite difficult to come up with a market policy to make this happen. So overall, they're all the pieces that form an integrated market environment in Australia. Electricity in the NEM, various different gas markets, coal markets, LGC and STC renewable markets, and coming and going a carbon market. And when you purchase your electricity from your retailer, what your retailer has to do is to operate in all these markets. They need to buy electricity from the wholesale market. They need to buy the stabilizing services from the wholesale electricity market. They need to buy renewable energy certificates, LGCs and STCs. And some states have their own certificates as well. They have to buy the transmission and distribution from the Powerlinks and Energexes of the world, put together a few other pieces, combine that all together in a bill for you. So it's a complicated place for a business to work in a strategic manner. And that brings us to the end of, as I said, a rambling tour through the various energy markets that we have in our state.
Right, thank you very much. So, as usual, we have a few minutes for asking questions. What I'll ask you to do is raise your hands, and I'll come to you as and when I see you. It's a little difficult. Be patient with me. I often see a hand over there and I have one over there, so I'm not told, which I've got on told. Sort of really wave or something. But we'll probably go for about 10 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
We'll see how it's flying. But otherwise, I'll ask for the first question. I think the gentleman right at the back has either yawning or he's got his hand up. Okay. You have to shout a little bit from way back there. You have to.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very comprehensive and everything is very simple. In a way, very fascinating. Just three very quick questions. One of the ones is that the AMO currently has a 30-minute settlement rule, and if you're going to be shifting to a 5-minute rule, what do you think the implications will be for batteries and the distribution of power with fossil fuels? The next question is about
Shall we just take one at a time? Because there are other people who might also want to ask. We'll see how that one goes, and then if it flows on, we'll do that. Did you get the question?
So the question is that the current market clears every 30 minutes. The settlements take place on the basis of a 30-minute average price. But in a couple of years, that is changing, and the market rules will now be every 5 minutes. There's a new price set, and there will be a financial settlement on the basis of that price each 5 minutes. Now, that is economists really pushing their barrow to be a really pure and competitive and very quite purist market. But it means, in practical terms, a large level of disruption in that risk systems, settlement systems, market databases all have to be upgraded. My rough guess is that cost to do those upgrades is probably of the order of $100 to $300 million, which I think far outweighs the purest transition to a 5-minute settlement. But the 5-minute settlement will not really provide much more opportunities for battery storage and other facilities if the market is operating in an honest manner. The way that the 5-minute settlement is really designed, the thing that consumers really hate about the 30-minute settlement is late rebidding. And what that means is if the electricity prices across those 6 5-minute intervals were $50, $50, $50, $50, $50, $50,